I wore rubber gloves to clean his toilet. His toilet. The man I was supposed to marry in 3 months. And the whole time I was on my knees scrubbing, I was worth more than his entire penthouse, the building it sat in, and every car parked in the garage underneath it. But I needed to see his soul before I gave him mine. And what I found in those 6 days almost destroyed me, not because it was all bad, because it was complicated. And complicated is always harder to survive than simply awful. Stay with me and subscribe, then press bell notification icon for next interesting stories, because this story doesn't end the way you think. If you've ever loved someone and wondered, truly wondered, whether they actually see you or just the version of you that's convenient and impressive and dressed well, then you already understand why I did what I did. My name is Solène. My father is Devereaux Okafor. Yes, that Okafor. The one on the magazine covers, the one with the foundations and the private jets, and the buildings with his name etched in marble. I grew up in that world, and I love my father, but I also know what that name does to people. It rearranges them. It makes them careful and performative, and soft in ways that have nothing to do with actual softness. So when I met Bastian Mercer at a private dinner in Geneva 2 years ago, I told myself, watch him. Not the version he performs for your father's table. Watch who he is when he thinks no one important is paying attention. I watched. For 2 years, I watched. And I saw flickers, small, worrying flickers of a man who looked straight through the people who served him. Not cruelly, exactly, just absently, like they didn't fully exist. My best friend Nadia said it plainly, the way only she can. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, stirred her tea, and said, "Solène, you've only ever seen him in a suit. You've never seen him at 6 a.m. arguing with his housekeeper. You don't actually know this man." She wasn't wrong. She was annoyingly completely right. It took me 2 weeks to arrange it. One call to a hospitality manager my family trusted completely, a temporary placement under a false name, Sella, as a relief housekeeper at Bastian's penthouse while his regular staff was rotating. 3 weeks before our engagement party, 6 days total. That was the plan. I showed up on a Tuesday morning with a cleaning kit, cheap sneakers, and a heartbeat that was doing something genuinely embarrassing. The penthouse manager, a small, warm woman called Adeline, handed me a printed list of instructions and a set of keys, and I stood in that elevator reading the list thinking, I once bought an entire floor of a building in this city just to house my father's art collection. And here I am, memorizing which surfaces prefer which spray. Bastian walked past me at 8 a.m. without looking down, just 2 words over his shoulder as he moved toward the kitchen. Don't touch anything on the east desk. No good morning, no hello, nothing. And I stood there, holding that mop, and I thought about the candlelit dinner 3 weeks earlier where he'd leaned across the table and told me I was the most captivating woman he'd ever known. Captivating. Right. Day 2 was worse. I knocked the plate off a shelf, a genuinely hideous gold thing, and it hit the floor and shattered. Bastian came in from his office, looked at the mess, looked at me, and told me, completely calmly, like he was discussing something minor, that Adeline would be deducting the cost from my wages. Then he went back to his desk. And a few minutes later, I heard him on the phone laughing about it. "Clumsy girl," he said to whoever was listening. "These people never pay attention." These people. Those 2 words landed somewhere deep, and they stayed there, sitting hot and heavy in my chest for the rest of the day. I sat in the bathroom that night and genuinely considered calling the whole thing off. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, the one where I walk back in as myself in my own coat and tell him I've changed my mind about everything. But then I thought about Nadia. I thought about 2 years. I thought about the fact that I had only seen flickers, and flickers aren't the whole fire. I went back the next morning. Day 3 brought his cousin Rafferty, loud, careless, the kind of man who treats every room like his personal stage. He saw me in the hallway and made a comment. It was the kind of comment that wears the costume of a joke so that no one can object without being accused of taking things too seriously. I didn't respond. I kept moving. But I stopped and I waited very quietly to see what Bastian would do. He looked at his drink, then he changed the subject, just pivoted the conversation smoothly, entirely. He didn't say anything to Rafferty, he didn't look at me, he just redirected, the way you might redirect a conversation about something mildly unpleasant that you'd prefer not to deal with right now. I went home and didn't sleep. Day 4 is the one I keep coming back to. I was in the kitchen early, too early, honestly, because I hadn't been sleeping well. I thought the penthouse was empty. Then Bastian walked in, still in a gray t-shirt, hair not yet organized into the version the world usually sees, looking like an almost completely different person. He opened the fridge, closed it, opened it again. I kept my head down and focused on what I was doing. And then he asked, very quietly, without any particular weight to it, "Did you eat this morning?" Just that, like it was nothing, like it was obvious. I was so caught off guard I nearly answered with my real name. I told him I hadn't eaten yet, and he cracked 4 eggs without another word, made something simple and good, and slid a plate across the counter in my direction. "I always make too many," he said. That was it. We didn't talk. We stood in that kitchen in near silence while the city started up outside the windows, and something in the atmosphere was different, like a door had opened somewhere in a house I'd been standing outside of for days. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just ate and said thank you and went back to work. After that, things shifted in small but undeniable ways. He started saying good morning. He stopped leaving messes in rooms he knew I'd have to move through. Once, and this is the one I keep returning to because he had absolutely no idea I was watching, he moved a heavy box from the middle of the hallway to the side before I got to that part of the corridor. Nobody asked him to do it. Nobody saw him do it, except me. The real test came on day 5. Adeline had a fall. Nothing serious, but she needed to go to hospital immediately. Bastian had his mother coming to tea that afternoon. His mother, who I knew from experience, did not take cancellations lightly. I watched him take the phone call about Adeline. I watched him make his decision. He canceled his mother without hesitation, drove Adeline himself, and sat with her at the hospital for 2 hours. When he came back, I was still there. I'd stayed to finish things, and he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. He stood in the hallway and said, almost to himself rather than to me, "She doesn't have anyone. I keep forgetting that." I keep forgetting that. There it was, not polished, not performed, just a man confronting something quiet and uncomfortable about himself, out loud in a hallway because the day had made him. That was the truest thing I'd heard from him in 2 years. Later that evening, I was in the utility room folding linens when he appeared in the doorway. He said my name, the one he knew, Sela, and when I answered, he was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding whether to continue. Then he told me I was different from the others who'd worked there. I asked, different how? He said, "You look at me like you're deciding something." It landed exactly like a fist in the chest, clean and precise. I told him I was just quiet. And he said, and I've thought about this 100 times since, "No, you're thinking. There's a difference." I couldn't do another day after that. Day 6. I came back in my own clothes, my real coat, my own face, the one without the uniform and the careful stillness of Sela. He was in the living room, and when he looked up, the confusion crossed his face first, and then the recognition came slow and absolute, like a tide that couldn't be stopped. He said my name, my real name, and I said yes. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. He didn't rage, he didn't perform the kind of dramatic anger that men use when they've been caught out and want to make themselves the wronged party. He sat down, like the floor had genuinely shifted under him, and pressed 2 fingers to his mouth and stared at the carpet. Then, slowly, he started cataloging himself. The plate? Yes. Rafferty? Yes. He was going back through 6 days and seeing himself through my eyes, and the shame on his face was real. Not the shame of being caught, but the shame of recognition, of seeing yourself clearly for the first time and not entirely liking what you find. He finally looked at me and said he didn't know what he wanted me to say to him. I told him not to say anything. I told him I had seen his worst, the dismissal and the carelessness, and the way he'd looked through a person who was standing right in front of him. I'd seen all of it. And I'd also seen a man make eggs for a stranger at 6 in the morning. I'd seen him move a box out of someone's path for no reason except that it was the decent thing to do. I'd seen him sit in a hospital waiting room for 2 hours with a woman who had nobody. I had seen that too. And the question was never whether he was a good man or a bad man. It was whether he was a man who was willing to actually look at himself. We didn't have an engagement party that spring. We pushed everything. We had conversations. Long, uncomfortable, necessary conversations, in ordinary clothes, in rooms without candles or performance. He went back to Adeline and apologized, not just for the plate, but for years of looking through her. She cried. He told me later he didn't know what to do with that, and I told him the answer was to sit with it, same way he'd sat with her at the hospital. I'm not standing here telling you this story has a perfect bow on it. Love doesn't. People don't. We are all, every single one of us, a collection of our best moments and our worst ones. And the question is simply this. When someone holds up a mirror, do you look away or do you look? What I know, what I'd say to any woman sitting in the place I was in, is this. You deserve to be loved by the version of him that no one is watching, not the version in the tux with everything at stake, the version in a gray t-shirt at 6 in the morning, in a quiet kitchen making eggs for a girl he barely knows, just because she hadn't eaten. That's the version that matters. That's the one worth staying for. And if you've made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you, truly. If any part of this felt familiar, leave it in the comments. I read everything. And if this moved you in some way, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone out there is standing at the same door I was, trying to decide whether the person on the other side is worth opening it for. Maybe this helps them decide. I'm Solène, and I'll see you in the next one.